Hey there, viewers. Before we jump into tonight's story, let me ask, have you ever heard something in the middle of the night that you just couldn't explain? Drop your experience in the comments below. Tonight's story comes from a chilling midnight encounter with Diddy's prison cell, and what was witnessed will leave you speechless. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. I had been at MDC Brooklyn for about 5 months when I first heard the screams. I remember the exact night because it was one of those times where the air in the prison felt heavier, like something was waiting to happen. You don't always notice it at first, but when you've been locked up long enough, you start picking up on things. The way the silence changes, the way a guard shifts his stance like he's bracing for something, the way some inmates stop talking all at once like they felt it too. MDC Brooklyn ain't like what people think when they picture prison. It's not all fights in the yard or big-shot gangsters running the place. No, it's worse. It's the kind of place that messes with your head before it even messes with your body. The walls are gray and cracked, and the air smells like sweat, bleach, and something sour that never really goes away. The toilets don't work half the time, and there's mold creeping up in the corners of the ceiling, curling like black veins. Nights are the worst. That's when the weight of it all presses down. The noises never fully stop. The clanking of metal doors, the shuffling of feet down the halls, the occasional sound of someone mumbling to themselves in a way that makes your skin crawl. But on some nights, there's a quiet that don't feel right, like the prison is holding its breath. That was the kind of night it was when I first heard him scream. At first I thought it was some other inmate messing around. People lose their minds in here. I've heard men laughing to themselves for hours straight. I've heard the sound of fists hitting walls so hard the skin peeled off their knuckles. I've even heard crying, the kind that don't sound human anymore. But this was different. It started with a low gasping noise, like someone struggling to breathe. Then came the first real scream. It was raw, torn straight from the gut. The kind of sound a person makes when they've seen something they weren't supposed to. It wasn't a fight scream, not a warning or a challenge. It was pure fear, the kind that made the hairs on my arms stand up. For a second, nobody moved. It was like every cell froze at once. Then, almost on cue, I heard someone 2 cells down chuckle. Looks like Diddy's finally meeting his demons. Another voice, further away, muttered, "About time." Somebody banged on the bars and shouted, "Shut up, man!" But the screaming didn't stop. It kept going, tearing through the quiet like a blade, and now there was something else mixed in. Words, maybe? I couldn't make them out. But he wasn't just screaming anymore. He was saying something, fast and frantic. I sat up on my cot and leaned against the cold bars, trying to see what was happening. I wasn't the only one. Inmates from the nearby cells were already pressed up against their own bars, peering into the dimly lit hallway. The guards, though, barely reacted. I saw one of them, Jackson, a heavy-set guy with bags under his eyes and a permanent scowl, walk up slow like he was bored. He didn't even look concerned. "Diddy, cut that shit out," he called, voice flat. Diddy didn't stop. Another scream, this one somehow worse than the first, like it was clawing its way out of his throat. I saw Jackson hesitate, just for a second. That's when I realized he wasn't bored. He was used to this. This had happened before. Jackson exhaled hard, rubbing a hand down his face before finally reaching for his keys. He was moving slow, though, too slow, like he was hoping Diddy would just wear himself out. The other guard on duty, Martinez, didn't even bother looking up from his seat by the control desk. I heard a shuffle of movement from one of the upper-tier cells. Then someone muttered, "Man's losing his damn mind." I wasn't sure if they were talking about Diddy or the guard. Another voice, closer, sounded almost amused. "You'd be screaming too if you had all that shit waiting for you outside." They weren't wrong. Even before he got locked up, the news had been bad for him. Every day, more stories, more accusations, new lawsuits stacking up like bricks, one on top of the other. I heard about the latest one just the other day. Some dude claiming Diddy had forced him into something messed up under the guise of helping his career. But that didn't explain this. It didn't explain why his screams sounded like something was in there with him. I couldn't see his cell from where I was, but I could picture it. A tiny windowless box, same as the rest of us. Just a metal bunk, a toilet, and a sink that barely worked. There wasn't anything in there. There couldn't be. So why did he sound like he was begging? Jackson finally reached the cell and slammed a fist against the bars. "Diddy, I'm not playing. You better calm the hell down before I make you." Silence. For a few seconds, the prison was dead still. No more screaming, no more thrashing. Even the usual murmuring of late-night conversations had stopped. I don't know why, but that silence felt worse than the noise. Then, just when I thought it was over, I heard something else. A whisper. Low, shaky, and too soft to make out. Jackson must have heard it too, because I saw his posture shift, shoulders tensing. He took another step closer, pressing his face up near the bars. "What?" More whispering. I strained to hear, but all I caught were a few fragmented words. "No, please, don't let them." "Them?" Jackson sighed. He looked back at Martinez, who still hadn't moved. "I need the key." Martinez just shook his head. Let him tire himself out. Another pause. Then Diddy let out a low, broken sob. And for some reason, that sound was worse than all the screaming put together. I ain't no fan of Diddy. Never cared for his music, never gave a damn about what he did outside of here. But in that moment, listening to a man like him sobbing like a scared little kid in the dark, I felt something heavy settle in my stomach. Because whatever was happening in that cell, whatever he was seeing, feeling, hearing, he believed it was real. And that meant I had to wonder, what if it was? Chapter 2. A broken man in a broken place. The next morning, the prison felt different, or maybe it was just me. That scream from last night hadn't left my head. I'd heard plenty of men break down in this place, but not like that. Not from someone like him. Diddy didn't make a sound for the rest of the night, and by the time the first round of breakfast trays clattered through the hall, it was like nothing had happened at all. The other inmates barely mentioned it, just a few chuckles and passing jokes before moving on to whatever else occupied their minds. That's how it is in here. People forget fast, or at least they pretend to. But I couldn't shake it. I had seen him before, back when he first came in. He wasn't like the rest of us. You could tell by the way he carried himself. Shoulders squared, head held high, still thinking he was the man he was out there. Back then, it was like he believed this was temporary, just a bad dream he'd wake up from. I remember watching him walk into the cafeteria that first week, chin up, looking around like he was surveying his empire. And in a way, he was. Some men fall apart the second they're locked up. Others adapt. Then there are those who think they can buy their way through anything, who believe their name still carries weight on the inside. Diddy was one of them. At first, he had the same smug confidence he always had in the interviews, the award shows, the parties. He cracked jokes, made a show of slapping backs, acting like he could charm his way into good favor. The kind of man who had never been told no in his life, and even now, even here, he thought he could bend the world to his will. But prison doesn't care who you were. I don't know when exactly it started changing for him, but it wasn't long. The first time I noticed something different, it was small. His walk wasn't as upright. His clothes started hanging a little looser. That cocky smirk didn't come as often. Maybe it was the first time he realized nobody here gave a damn about who he was. Maybe it was the whispers that followed him everywhere. Words tossed under breaths when he passed by. The kind that burrow under your skin. See, in prison, reputation matters, but it ain't the kind of reputation he had. Out there, he was a mogul, a billionaire, a man people feared or admired. In here, he was just another name on a list. And worse, He was a name tied to some of the most disgusting accusations a man could have. The charges against him weren't just fraud or tax evasion, things that might earn him a bit of respect in certain circles. No, his crimes were different. The kind that made other inmates look at him sideways, made them whisper when he walked by. Allegations of drugging women, of trafficking, of taking advantage of people too young or too scared to fight back. The new lawsuits weren't helping either. Fresh accusations popping up almost weekly. Some of them were from women, some from men. People who had stayed quiet for years but were now coming forward, as if the walls around him were finally caving in. The rumors about him started fast. Some said he was trying to get sick on purpose, hoping they'd transfer him to the medical wing. Others claimed he was faking a mental breakdown to get a lighter sentence. But there were a few who weren't so sure. I overheard a conversation a few days before the screaming started. Two guys in the rec area, speaking low, but not low enough. "You see his hands lately," one of them muttered. "What about them?" "Shitting." I glanced over at where Diddy was sitting alone, staring down at the table. His hands were curled into loose fists on top of his tray, but even from a distance I could see it. The slight, involuntary twitch in his fingers. "He's just playing it up," the other guy said, trying to look weak. "Maybe, but you know what I heard?" The first guy leaned in. "He don't sleep no more. Guards say he's up all night talking to himself, saying weird shit." That part didn't surprise me. I had already noticed the change. He wasn't eating like he used to. His face had thinned out, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His beard, once neat and trimmed, was starting to grow and patchy. The cocky billionaire was gone. In his place was someone else. Someone hollow. "Et vice la métissa, ha devet anstret." And then there were the eyes. That was the part that unsettled me the most. Diddy always had a certain look in his eyes, that calculating sharpness that told you he was always a step ahead. But now his eyes were different. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper, something fractured, like he wasn't just tired, but haunted. Some nights, when the hallways were quiet, I'd catch glimpses of him, sitting on his bunk, staring into the dark, not sleeping, not reading, just staring at nothing. Like he was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. And then the screaming started. That night wasn't the first time he had made noise, but was the first time it sounded like that. The way his voice cracked, the way his breath hitched between cries, it wasn't just fear. It was pure, unfiltered terror. The next morning, the whispers were louder. "Man's losing it." Heard he was crying. "Y'all think he's sick?" Nobody had answers, just theories. Some were convinced he was playing a long game, trying to get sympathy before his trial. Others thought the weight of it all was finally breaking him, the years of running, of dodging consequences, finally catching up. But one guy, an older inmate who had been around longer than most, shook his head when I asked him about it. "I've seen men pretend," he said. "I've seen men fake sick, fake crazy, fake everything, but I know real fear when I hear it." I thought about that later, lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling. Real fear. Whatever was happening to Diddy, whatever was making him scream like that in the middle of the night, it wasn't pretend. And that thought sat heavy in my chest, because it meant one thing. Something was really happening to him. Something was getting to him. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, sooner or later, it was going to get worse. Chapter 3. The Midnight Horror. I don't know what woke me first, the scream or the feeling that something was already wrong before I even opened my eyes. Prison does something to your instincts. You learn to sleep light, your mind half awake even when your body is drained. You start to recognize the sounds that mean trouble, the way a shuffling step can mean a fight is about to break out, the way a certain kind of silence means the guards are coming. But this was different. The air was thick, stale, and unnaturally still, like the whole block was holding its breath. Then came the scream. A jagged, raw sound tore through the darkness, yanking me out of sleep so fast my chest felt tight. It wasn't like the one from before. This one was worse, more desperate, more human, and somehow less at the same time. I shot up on my bunk, heart hammering, and I wasn't the only one. All around me, I heard the groaning of metal bunks as other inmates stirred. The guy in the cell next to me, Parker, let out an annoyed grunt. "Man, not this shit again," he muttered, rubbing his face. Somebody shut him up. But Diddy didn't shut up. The screaming turned into something else, something frantic and guttural, like he was choking on his own breath. Then came the banging, loud, violent, the unmistakable sound of a body slamming against the walls of a cell, over and over. I swallowed hard, straining to hear more. I had been in this place long enough to know the rhythm of fights, the way a struggle usually played out, but this wasn't normal. It wasn't a scuffle between cellmates, not some beef boiling over. There was a pattern to it, something erratic, like he wasn't fighting another person, like he was fighting something else. The air was colder than usual, or maybe it was just me. Another scream ripped through the block, followed by a deep, dragging sound. Metal against metal. I clenched my fists, my stomach tightening. That wasn't a sound that should have been coming from a locked cell. More voices murmured around me. Some guys just cussed under their breath, pissed off to be woken up. Others sat up, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim glow of the emergency lights lining the corridor. A few got up, pressing their faces against their bars, waiting. "Yo," a voice called from the upper tier. "The hell is he doing?" Nobody answered. A loud thud made the entire block shudder. I flinched. It sounded like a body had hit the floor. Hard. That was when the guards finally showed up. Their boots echoed down the corridor, slow and heavy, as if they were already exhausted by whatever this was. I recognized them. Jackson and Martinez, the same ones from before. They looked more annoyed than anything, like they had seen this 100 times already. Martinez walked up first, stopping just outside the cell. His keys jingled as he shifted his weight, peering through the bars. "Calmed," he said flatly. "You good in there?" My silence. Not the kind of silence you'd expect. Not the kind where someone's catching their breath or holding back tears. This was wrong. I leaned forward, gripping the bars tighter. The other inmates were quiet now, too. We were all waiting. Then Diddy whispered something. It was faint, shaky. The words weren't clear at first, but the more I focused, the more I could make them out. No, play." Martinez rolled his eyes. "Here we go," he muttered, glancing at Jackson. "I told you, man, he's just playing crazy." Jackson didn't look so sure. Something about the way he hesitated made my stomach drop. Martinez sighed and reached for his keys. "All right, Combs, I'm coming in." That was when the door creaked open on its own. A hush fell over the entire block. Martinez stopped mid-step, his hand still hovering near his belt. Jackson tensed. From my angle, I could barely see inside the cell, just enough to make out a shape curled up in the corner. Diddy was on the floor, his back against the wall, knees drawn up to his chest. He was shaking, his head jerking slightly like he was trying to listen for something just beyond our reach. Then he lifted his face, and I swear my blood went cold. His eyes were wide, pupils blown out so far that they swallowed almost all the color. Sweat slicked his skin, soaking into his jumpsuit. His lips were moving, but no sound came out, like he had run out of air. And then he looked right at me. I don't know why, but for a second it felt like he saw through me. A muscle in his jaw twitched, his fingers gripping the fabric of his jumpsuit so tightly they trembled. And then, just as Martinez took another step forward, Diddy whispered something again. "They're here." Nobody moved. Martina let out a slow breath. "Who's here?" he asked, tone dripping with irritation. Diddy didn't answer. His breathing quickened, his whole body going rigid. His gaze darted to the ceiling, to the corners of his cell, to the empty space beside him. Martinez shook his head and moved toward him. The second his boot hit the cell floor, the light above flickered. A static crackle filled the silence, buzzing through the vents. Then the temperature dropped. I felt it even from my cell. It wasn't just a draft or a trick of my mind. The air actually changed. A sharp, bitter cold settled over the room, cutting through the usual stuffy heat of the block. My breath felt thick in my throat. Diddy's lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven jerks. Then, in one sudden motion, he lurched forward. Martinez jumped back, swearing under his breath. Diddy hit the floor, his hands slapping against the concrete, his breath coming out in ragged, wet gasps. His head snapped up, and for a brief moment I saw something that didn't make sense. His lips were moving, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was lower, guttural, like something was speaking through him. I felt my stomach twist. Martinez and Jackson must have felt it too, because suddenly, neither of them looked amused. Jackson reached for his radio. "We need backup." Diddy let out a strangled, shuddering gasp, his body convulsing once before he collapsed. The lights flickered again, then everything went still. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Martinez hesitated, then carefully stepped forward. He crouched down, pressing 2 fingers against Diddy's throat. A tense pause. Then, finally, he exhaled. "He's still breathing." Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Get the nurse," he muttered, already turning away. The other inmates started murmuring again, but none of them sounded amused anymore. I stayed where I was, gripping the bars so tight my knuckles ached. Diddy lay motionless on the floor of his cell, his face still twisted in something between terror and exhaustion. Whatever had just happened, I had the feeling it wasn't over. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what would happen next. Chapter 4: The Man in the Shadows. The air inside Diddy's cell was wrong. I'd smelled the inside of plenty of prison cells before. Stale sweat, damp clothes, metal, and rust. But this one had a different weight to it. It wasn't just bad. It was heavy. Like the air itself didn't want to move. Like something unseen was pressing down on it, squeezing the room tighter, making it smaller. The guards had left the cell door cracked open just enough that I could see inside. I don't even remember stepping closer, but I must have. Curiosity, or something worse, pulled me forward. Diddy was on his knees in the middle of the room, his back hunched, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven bursts. His hands, trembling and slick with sweat, pressed against the cold concrete floor. His jumpsuit clung to his body, darkened with moisture. The collar stretched and pulled like he'd been clawing at it. His breath was ragged, wheezing, but it was his face that made me stop. I'd seen fear before, real fear. The kind a man gets when he knows he's about to be jumped, or when a guard beats him bad enough that he's praying he wakes up the next morning. But I'd never seen this. His eyes, wide, unblinking, weren't looking at me. Not really. They were looking through me. Past me. Like I wasn't even there. The shadows stretched long across the cell, the dim light flickering above like it was struggling to stay on. I don't know if it was a trick of the failing bulb, but for a second, I swore the shadows in the corner of his cell looked deeper than they should have been. He mumbled something. At first, I thought he was just muttering nonsense, but then I saw his lips moving fast, too fast, whispers tumbling out in a frantic rush, some words overlapping others. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't pleading. It was bargaining. I took a slow breath. "Diddy?" He flinched, just barely. His eyes twitched in my direction, but they still weren't seeing me. His pupils were too wide, swallowing almost all the brown in his irises. He looked like a man lost in something bigger than the room around him. Who are you talking to?" I asked before I could stop myself. I didn't expect him to answer. He hadn't even acknowledged Martinez or Jackson before they dragged him out the first time. But now, his lips kept moving, his voice a breathless murmur, almost too soft to hear. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Then I did. "Doolin, I didn't mean to, I swear. No, I didn't. Please, I didn't know." My stomach tightened. His voice cracked on the last part, thick with something raw. He wasn't just afraid, he was broken. I took another step closer, even though every nerve in my body told me I shouldn't. "Diddy?" I tried again. "What the hell are you?" A sharp knock echoed through the cell block. I jumped. It didn't come from my cell, it didn't come from outside. It came from inside Diddy's cell. I froze, staring past him, into the darker part of the room. Nothing was there. Just an empty corner, just a concrete wall, just a shadow that didn't feel quite right. But then I saw his hands. His fingers dug into the floor, his nails scraping against the concrete like he was bracing himself. His head tilted ever so slightly, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, just barely above a whisper, "Don't let it take me." I felt ice slide down my spine. "What?" I whispered. Diddy squeezed his eyes shut. He started shaking his head, whispering faster now, like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. And then his head snapped up, so fast it made my chest tighten. His breath hitched, and his body jerked once, like something had grabbed him by the collar and yanked. I swore I saw his feet leave the floor for half a second. His lips parted, and a rasp slipped out. "Low, ragged," was in the room. The words didn't sound like his. I took a step back. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until my lungs burned. I turned my head slightly, glancing toward the door, waiting for one of the guards to tell me to back up, to shove me away. But the hallway was empty. They had left the door open, but nobody was watching. Diddy flinched again, his head tilting to the side like he was listening to something just past my shoulder. His eyes darted toward the farthest corner of the cell, the one swallowed in darkness. I didn't want to look. I really didn't. But I did. And for half a second, just the briefest moment, I thought I saw something shift. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even really a shape. But the shadow there moved. Just slightly. A shift in the dark. Something folding in on itself. Curling. Pulling. And then Diddy screamed. Not like before. Not just fear. This was different. This was pain. His body twisted as he threw himself backward, slamming into the side of the cot. His hands flew up, clawing at something unseen, his nails dragging through empty air like he was fighting off invisible hands. His head snapped to the side, lips trembling, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I staggered backward, my own heart pounding in my ears. Diddy wasn't faking. I knew that now. Whatever this was, whatever he was seeing, it was real to him. And the worst part? A small, awful part of me was starting to believe it was real to me too. I stumbled away from the door, breath sharp in my throat. I needed to get out of here. I needed to get out. Diddy's voice cracked through the air again, this time a whisper so fragile it barely made it past his lips. "Don't let it take me." I turned, practically crashing into the bars of my own cell as I backed away. My fingers gripped the cold steel, heart slamming against my ribs. The guards weren't coming. Nobody was coming. It was just me. Me and the man in the cell. And the shadow that had started to move. Chapter 5. The Whispers of the Past. I tried to shake off what I saw in Diddy's cell. Tried to tell myself it was just his mind breaking down. just another man losing it inside these walls. But the more I thought about it, the harder it was to push away the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. And I wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, things got worse. At first, I thought maybe the guards had finally sent him to medical. He wasn't in the cafeteria the next morning. His cell was shut tight, no sign of him. Most inmates didn't care, barely even noticed. But some of us, we were waiting, listening. And then he came back. I saw him during rec, sitting alone at one of the metal tables in the yard. His shoulders were hunched forward, his hands shaking slightly as he rubbed his thumb against his palm over and over, like he was trying to comfort himself. His jumpsuit, already loose from the weight he'd lost, looked almost 2 sizes too big now. But it wasn't just his body that had changed, it was the way he moved. Before, even when he started looking rough, he still carried himself like he was somebody, like he thought this place was beneath him, temporary. That swagger, that confidence, gone. Now he twitched at every little sound, his head snapping toward even the faintest noises. And then he started talking. Not to anyone, not out loud, but to himself. It started in the yard. Low, muttered words, lips barely moving. The first time I noticed, I thought maybe he was praying. Then I got closer. His voice was too fast, stumbling over itself. And he wasn't talking like someone asking for forgiveness. He was talking like someone arguing. I couldn't make out all of it, just bits and pieces as I walked past. I didn't know, you don't understand. I didn't mean to. Then a pause, like he was listening. Then, softer, almost broken. Wait. I stopped walking. Diddy didn't even notice. He kept his head down, fingers curled tight, his whole body tensed, like he was waiting for something to hit him. That was when I realized this wasn't the first time he'd done this. He'd been whispering to himself for days, in the cafeteria, in the showers, even during head count. At first, people thought it was just stress. A man like him facing the things he was facing. It made sense. But the more it happened, the more people started watching. And the rumors spread fast. He's seeing shit, Parker muttered one night, arms folded as he leaned against the bars of his cell. I heard one of the COs say they caught him in his bunk at 3 a.m, shaking like a damn leaf. I didn't say anything. I ain't surprised, another guy said from across the hall. Man's got too many ghosts. Bet they're finally knocking. It was a joke, but nobody laughed. That was the thing about this place. Whether you were religious or not, whether you believed in spirits or thought it was all bullshit, you knew this place had a weight to it. People cracked, some fast, some slow. But this felt different. And it wasn't just him. People started feeling things when they were near him. One guy swore the air around Diddy's cell was colder than the rest of the block. Another said he walked past him in the hallway and felt something press against his chest, like an invisible hand pushing him back. A few even said they heard him whispering when he wasn't moving his mouth. The worst part, I believed them, because I'd been near him too, and I knew they weren't lying. Then came the other rumor, the one that made everything worse. The HIV whispers. That rumor had been floating around ever since he got locked up, but lately it was coming up more. Some people swore up and down that was why he was deteriorating, that it wasn't just the stress, the lawsuits, the guilt. It was his body shutting down. Man looks worse every day. One guy whispered at lunch, barely touching his food. I swear, his skin's getting all gray. You see his face? Yeah, another muttered. He's sick, you can tell. Then came the speculation. What if the screaming wasn't just in his head? What if he wasn't just breaking down? What if something else was happening? Some thought he was dying, that he had been sick this whole time, covering it up, and now that he couldn't hide behind his money, the truth was spilling out. Others thought it wasn't sickness, it was punishment. That man's got too many skeletons, one of the lifers said, shaking his head. He did too much dirt. You can't do the things he did and expect to just walk away clean. That was what stuck with me, because it made sense. It made more sense than anything else. Diddy wasn't just afraid of prison. He wasn't just afraid of the lawsuits. He was afraid of something else. And whatever it was eating him alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not just because of the rumors, not just because of the whispers, but because when the block went quiet, I heard something else. Not screaming, not crying, just a voice, low, uneven, muttering. I turned my head toward his cell. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. I pressed my lips together, listening. No, please. A pause. Then, barely audible, "Don't make me see it again." A shiver crawled down my back. I turned over, squeezed my eyes shut, and forced myself not to listen, not to think, not to wonder what he was seeing. Because deep down, I had a terrible feeling. I didn't want to know. Chapter 6. The incident that shook the prison. Days passed, but whatever had gotten to Diddy wasn't letting go. If anything, it was getting worse. He stopped talking to people entirely. Not that he had ever been particularly social, but now it was different. Before, he carried himself like he still had control, like he still had a name that mattered. That was gone. Now he avoided everyone, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. He barely ate, barely slept. And when he did sleep, he didn't stay asleep for long. Some nights I'd hear him jolt awake, gasping like he had been drowning in his own dreams. The guards were noticing too. I caught glimpses of them watching him, their usual indifference shifting into something else. They didn't laugh at him anymore, didn't roll their eyes like they had when he first started unraveling. They looked at him like he was a problem they didn't know how to fix. It wasn't just nighttime anymore either. One afternoon, during head count, I saw him standing in the back of the line, his hands clenched so tight I thought his nails might draw blood. His eyes weren't focused on the guards, weren't following orders like the rest of us. Instead, they were locked on a spot near the far wall. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The guy next to him shifted uncomfortably. "Yo," he muttered under his breath. "You good?" Diddy didn't respond. He just kept staring. Then, so quickly I barely saw it happen, his whole body flinched. Like something had touched him, grabbed him. He stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the guy next to him. The moment contact was made, the other inmate jumped back, cursing. The fuck? Diddy's breathing turned sharp, uneven. His head snapped around wildly, eyes darting between us like he wasn't sure where he was anymore. He stepped backward again, his back hitting the wall. The guards reacted immediately. "Yo, Combs, stand still." Diddy didn't. He pressed himself harder against the wall, fingers twitching at his sides. I saw the way his chest heaved, the way his eyes were too wide, too dark. He wasn't just afraid, he was terrified. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear it at first. The guard closest to him hesitated, his expression shifting into something unreadable. "What?" Diddy whispered again, his voice hoarse, cracking. "It's right there." Nobody knew what to say. For a second, it was like the whole prison went still, like everything had stopped, just to hear what he would say next. Then, just when I thought he had gone completely silent, Diddy shuddered violently and turned his head sharply to the left. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his gaze locking onto something behind the guard. A chill ran up my spine. Nothing was there. But Diddy? He saw something. The moment stretched too long, the kind of pause that makes your skin crawl. The guard, clearly unnerved, didn't push it. "Take him back to his cell," he muttered to another officer. Diddy didn't resist. That was the worst part. He went willingly, head down, body tense, but not fighting, like a man walking toward a fate he already knew was waiting for him. I should have let it go. Should have told myself it was just stress, paranoia, sickness, whatever excuse made the most sense. But I couldn't shake the way he twitched when no one had touched him. I couldn't shake the way he stared at something that wasn't there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. That night the screaming came back. But this time, it was different. I was already awake when it started. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, not after what I'd been seeing. I had been lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the prison at night. Low murmurs, the occasional snore, the distant sound of a radio playing from the guard station. Then, at exactly 12:17 a.m., a sudden bang echoed through the block. I sat up fast. It wasn't just a noise, it was movement. The sound of a body slamming against metal. Then came the scream. Not just one. Several. A series of ragged, panicked cries, cut off by the sound of something heavy being thrown across the cell, a sharp crash, then another. People woke up fast. I could hear muttered voices, irritated groans, someone cursing under their breath. But nobody said much, not yet. They were waiting. Then came the voice. Diddy's. But it wasn't normal. It was low, guttural, the words tumbling out too fast like he wasn't fully in control of his own mouth. I told you no, I can't. Another crash. There's something else. A sound that didn't belong in this prison. A whisper. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. But I heard it. A soft, breathy murmur, just beneath Diddy's own voice, layered underneath his panic. And suddenly he wasn't the only one screaming. Somebody else, another inmate, shouted, "What the fuck is happening in there?" The guards rushed in this time. Jackson and Martinez, plus another CO I didn't recognize. They moved fast, keys jangling, flashlights cutting through the dim corridor. Martinez reached the cell first. He shoved the key into the lock, twisting hard. I heard the heavy metal door groan as it swung open. Then he stopped. I'll never forget the way he froze. The way his entire body went rigid, shoulders stiff, hands tightening around his baton. The way Jackson, right behind him, took a step back. I craned my neck, trying to see past them, trying to understand what the hell they were looking at. Then Martinez whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. What the fuck? I didn't see much, just a glimpse. A flash of Diddy on the floor, curled up, his back against the wall. His jumpsuit was soaked, not just with sweat. His knuckles were raw, bleeding. His breathing was ragged, wet. But the worst part, his eyes. They weren't looking at the guards. They weren't looking at any of us. They were locked onto the corner of the cell, the one filled with shadows, the one that suddenly felt deeper than it should have been. Then he whispered, just 2 words. And wake up, it's laughing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time since I'd been locked up, I saw a guard step away from an inmate. Jackson, he took a full step back, like he wanted to get as far from Diddy's cell as possible. Martinez swallowed hard, shaking off whatever had just crawled up his spine. We need medical, he muttered. Now. Within minutes, Diddy was gone, dragged out of the cell, half conscious. By morning, the rumors were everywhere. They're moving him to medical. Yeah, they're putting him in psych. He's trying to fake his way into a transfer. They're sending him to a real hospital. Nobody knew the truth. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't over. Chapter 7, The Final Encounter. Diddy was gone for 3 days. 3 long, uneasy days where the block felt different. I wouldn't say calmer. Prison is never calm, but there was a shift, like a pressure had been lifted from the air. Like whatever had been weighing down on us had loosened just a little. The night he was taken away, I barely slept, but when morning came, it was like the whole place agreed to pretend it hadn't happened. The guards went about their business like they hadn't seen something that shook them. The inmates made their usual jokes, kept their usual routines, but something about the way people spoke was different. Less eye contact, voices kept lower, as if nobody wanted to accidentally say the wrong thing and invite whatever had been in that cell to notice them next. The rumors started almost immediately. Some said he was in the medical ward, strapped down to a bed, sedated beyond recognition. Others claimed he was faking the whole thing, that he had gotten exactly what he wanted, a private room away from the rest of us, a chance to wait out his trial in comfort. But then there were the ones who spoke quieter, their voices edged with something heavier than gossip. "Was never faking," Parker muttered to me on the second day. "You saw it. You know he wasn't." I didn't argue. I had spent the past 2 days trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I saw. That Diddy's whispers, his terror, the way he had clawed at something unseen in his cell. It was all just a breakdown. A man finally cracking under the weight of his own sins. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I kept hearing that last thing he had said before they dragged him out. "It's lacking." What the hell was he seeing? The morning of the third day, he came back. I was sitting in the yard when I saw him. At first, I thought I was seeing things because he looked worse. His frame, already thin, had shrunk even more, like his body was collapsing in on itself. His skin had a grayish tint to it, like he had spent a week locked in the dark with nothing but bad dreams. His eyes were sunken, but the worst part was that they didn't stop moving. He was looking at everything and nothing, scanning the yard, his fingers twitching like he was waiting for something to grab him at any moment. Nobody approached him. He was Diddy billionaire mogul, a man who once had the world in his hands, but now he was just another inmate. And worse than that, he was one people didn't want to be near. I didn't know why I got up and walked toward him. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something heavier than that, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since that first night I heard him scream. Either way, I found myself stepping in front of him, blocking the sun, making him look up at me with those wild, haunted eyes. "You..." My voice came out rougher than I meant. "You good?" He didn't answer right away. For a second, I wasn't even sure he had heard me. Then, slowly, his lips parted. "They don't like the light." I felt my stomach tighten. "What?" Diddy's eyes darted past my shoulder, looking at something that wasn't there. His hands twitched, curling into fists against his lap. "They don't like the light," he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't matter, they're always watching. They're always waiting." A shiver worked its way up my spine. "Diddy, who's watching?" His breathing hitched. He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, his throat bobbing. Then he leaned forward just slightly, enough that I caught the sharp scent of sweat and something sour beneath it. His voice dropped to a whisper, but I could still hear the shake in it. "The shadows," he murmured. "The ones that move when you're not looking. The ones that touch you when you sleep." I exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to step back. "You're just..." I stopped myself before I could say imagining things, because I didn't believe that anymore. Diddy's fingers twitched again, his shoulders curling inward. "They don't come all at once," he said. "They come slow, just enough to let you know they're there, just enough to make you doubt what you saw." I felt a weight settle in my chest. "Diddy," I said, carefully keeping my voice level. "Are you seeing them now?" His whole body went rigid, his breathing hitched, sharp and uneven, his fingers clenching and unclenching. He didn't answer. And that was enough. A flicker of movement caught my eye. My breath stalled. Behind him, just beyond the chain-link fence, the shadow of the building stretched long across the yard. The sun was lowering, the light slanting at just the right angle to make the darkness seem deeper. But for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something shift. Not a person, not an object, just a flicker of movement where there shouldn't have been one. Diddy must have seen the change in my expression because his lips trembled, his hands curling tighter into fists. "You see them too," he breathed. I looked back at him. I could have said no, could have told him he was crazy, that the prison was just getting to him. But I didn't, because something about the way the shadow had moved, not drifted, not stretched, but moved, made my skin crawl. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something that hadn't been there before. Not just unease, not just fear, recognition. Diddy swallowed, his throat dry. "They don't want me talking to you," he whispered. I forced myself to breathe. Why? His gaze darted past my shoulder again, locking on to something behind me. His pupils dilated, his jaw clenched, and then, his lips barely moving, he breathed out a single, chilling word. "Run." A sharp chill ran up my spine. I turned my head, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see... what? Something impossible, something that shouldn't exist? But there was nothing. Just the fence, just the building, just the long stretch of shadows. Too long. I turned back to Diddy, but his expression had changed. His face was blank now, like he had shut himself off. The guards were moving toward us. I hadn't even realized they had been watching. One of them called his name, and just like that, the moment was over. Diddy didn't fight when they took him, didn't speak. He just let them drag him back inside, his head low, his lips pressed together in a tight line. I stood there for a long time, staring after him. And when I finally turned to head back to my cell, I made the mistake of glancing at the shadows one last time. They weren't moving. Not anymore. But for the first time since I'd been locked up, I had the sickening feeling that something was looking back. And it knew I had seen it. Chapter 8. The Silence After the Storm. Diddy was never the same after that night. Whatever had been gnawing at him, whatever had been following him in the dark, it had finally taken something from him. Maybe it was his mind. Maybe it was something deeper. Either way, he wasn't screaming anymore. He wasn't whispering either. The next morning, when the guards dragged him back into the block, it was like they were escorting a different man. His face was empty, blank, in a way that didn't make sense. His shoulders were slumped, his steps slow, but not like he was weak, more like he was hollow. The Diddy that walked back into MDC Brooklyn wasn't the same man I had spoken to in the yard. His eyes didn't dart around anymore. He didn't twitch. He didn't flinch at sudden noises. He just existed. Like whatever had been tormenting him had finally won, and now there was nothing left to torment. And that was somehow worse. No one spoke to him, not the guards, not the inmates. He had always been something of an outsider, but now it was different. Now it felt like we weren't just ignoring him. We were avoiding him. The silence around him was suffocating. People didn't joke about him anymore. There were no more whispers about his lawsuits, his money, his past. It was like the entire prison had collectively decided that whatever was wrong with him was none of our business. And in a place where people thrived off of rumors, that meant something. I watched him more than I should have. It wasn't on purpose. It was like my brain refused to let me forget that I had seen too much. He still came out for rec, still sat in the cafeteria, still existed in the same space as the rest of us. But he was different. He didn't eat much. He didn't talk. He didn't even react when other inmates shoved past him, testing to see if he would snap. And his eyes, his damn eyes, they weren't darting around anymore, looking for threats. They weren't watching the guards, the inmates, the doors. They were locked somewhere else. I'd seen inmates broken before, seen them withdraw, shut down, fade into themselves. But this wasn't that. This wasn't a man giving up. This was a man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And now, he was waiting. The guards started keeping more distance from him. I could tell they didn't like being near him any more than the inmates did. Even Martinez, who had been quick to brush things off in the beginning, wasn't making jokes anymore. One night, I overheard a conversation between two COs near the guard station. "I don't like going near his cell," one of them muttered. "You scared of a celebrity now?" "No, man, it's not that. It's just, I don't know, it feels different in there." The other guard scoffed. "Different how?" A long pause. "Like it's not empty." I shuddered. Whatever had been tormenting Diddy, whatever had made him scream like that, it hadn't left. It was still here. And now, it was quiet. That was the worst part. The silence. It should have been a relief. No more screaming, no more whispering, no more terrified muttering in the dead of night. But the silence felt wrong, heavy, like something was holding its breath. And the longer it went on, the worse it got. Some nights, I'd catch myself listening, straining my ears, expecting to hear him whispering again, begging for something unseen to leave him alone. But there was nothing. One night, long after the block had settled, I woke up with a start. I didn't know why at first. There was no noise, no movement, nothing to jolt me awake. But my skin was cold, my heart hammering against my ribs, like I had just felt something leave. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not frantic, just a breath of sound, so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But I didn't, because I recognized the words. The same words he had muttered in the yard. The same words he had whispered in his cell, over and over, in a voice that barely belonged to him. "Timmy don't like the light." I squeezed my eyes shut, forced myself to breathe, forced myself not to turn my head, not to look at the shadows in the corners of my cell. Because if I did, I was afraid I'd see something looking back. The next morning, Diddy was gone. Not transferred, not in medical, just gone. His cell was empty. His name was erased from the duty rosters. When I asked Parker if he had seen where they took him, he just shook his head. Nobody knows. Nobody wanted to know. I should have let it go, should have moved on. But I couldn't. Because for the next 3 nights, after lights out, after the prison settled into uneasy quiet, I still heard it. Not screaming, not crying, just a whisper. Low, almost playful, like laughter. And I wasn't sure if it was coming from the empty cell across from me, or if it was coming from somewhere closer.